Hello, this is Rabbi David Abramson. Occasionally, in my twice-a-month recordings, I depart from Parashat HaShavua, from the Torah portion of the week, talking instead about a holiday coming up or some other related topic. Well, I'm going to do that again today. I'd like to talk to you about Sefirat Ha, the counting of the omer. Every night since the second night of Pesach, we Jews have been performing a curious ritual. We've been counting. The ritual is known as Sefirat Ha, the counting of the omer, and we are counting the days until the holiday of Shavuot. I want to initially pose three questions. How do we do it? How do we do this counting? Second, why do we do it? And third, do we really fulfill the mitzvah, the commandment? So let's begin exploring how we count the omer. First, we recite a bracha, and passage number 1 is that bracha. It begins with the standard bracha formula. It begins with Baruch atah Adonai, praised are you, Adonai, Eloheinu, our God, Melech haolam, ruler of the universe, Asher kedeshanu b'mitzvotav, who sanctified us by your commandments, Vitzivanu, and commanded us, al Sefirat Ha, regarding counting the omer. This evening, not long before I began this recording, I counted the omer, and so passage number 2 is tonight's counting. And so after reciting the bracha, I declared, Hayom Achad Asar Yom, today is 11 days, Shehem Shavua Achad ve'arba'a Yamim, totaling 1 week and 4 days, La Omer, of the omer. In the counting, we first indicate the total number of days and then the number of weeks. So in this case, tonight we counted 11 days, and that total was 1 week and 4 days. The math is pretty simple at this early stage of counting the omer. The second question is, why do we do it? And here is one of the sources of the mitzvah from Leviticus chapter 23. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, Adonai spoke to Moses saying, Daber el bnei Yisrael, v'amarta alehem, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, Ki tavo el haaretz asher ani noten lachem, when you enter the land that I am giving you, uktzartem et ketzirach, and you reap its harvest, v'havetem et omer reshit ketzirachem el hakohen, you shall bring the first sheaf and omer of your harvest to the kohen. So the word omer means a sheaf of grain, and the Hebrew word kohen means priest. In ancient Judaism, rather than having rabbis and cantors, the kind of clergy that we associate with contemporary Judaism, we had kohanim, we had priests, a hereditary priesthood. Moses' brother Aaron was the first kohen gadol, the first high priest. He and his sons were the first kohanim, and then their sons and their sons and their sons. And so in ancient times, one would bring a sheaf, an omer, of the early barley harvest as a thanksgiving offering and present it to the kohen, present it to the priest. Verse 11, V'henif et haomer lifnei Adonai lirtzonechem, he shall elevate the omer before Adonai for acceptance on your behalf. Mimochorat haShabbat yinifenu hakohen, on the day following the Shabbat, the kohen shall elevate it. Now usually when the Torah uses the term Shabbat, it's referring to that holiday that occurs every 7 days. But sometimes the word Shabbat is used to refer to some other major festival on which most of the Shabbat prohibitions apply. In this context, Shabbat is used to refer to the first day of Pesach. Verse 15, Usfartem lachem mimochorat haShabbat, you shall count from the day after the Shabbat, again, the day after the first day of Pesach, in other words, the second day of Pesach, miyom haviachem et omer hatenufa, from the day on which you bring the omer of elevation offering. Sheva Shabbatot temimot tihiena, they shall be 7 complete weeks. Verse 16, ad mimochorat haShabbat hashvi'it tisperu chamishim yom, until the day after the 7th week, you must count 50 days. V'ikravtem mincha chadasha ladonai. Then you shall bring an offering of new grain to Adonai. So on the second day of Pesach, we bring a sheaf of grain as a thanksgiving for the early spring barley harvest. And then 50 days later, on the holiday of Shavuot, we bring an offering of new grain to thank God for the later spring harvest, namely the wheat harvest. So the significant parts of the mitzvah are found in verses 10, 15, and then part of 16. The first part of the mitzvah is bringing an omer, bringing a sheaf of grain to the Kohen. And the second part of the mitzvah is counting from the day that you brought the omer, counting 7 complete weeks, counting 50 days. Very simple. But today, can we really fulfill the mitzvah? Here's a brief discussion of that question in the Talmud. Amar Abaye. Abaye said, Mitzvah lememane yomei, u'mitzvah lememane shavuei. It is a mitzvah to count the days, and also it's a mitzvah to count the weeks. Rabbanan devei Rav Ashi, manu yomei u'manu shavuei. The rabbis of the school of Rav Ashi used to count the days as well as the weeks. However, Amemar mane yomei, v'la mane shavuei. Meimar used to count the days, but not the weeks. Amar zecher lamikdashu, saying it is only a remembrance of the temple. So it appears that those in the school of Rav Ashi fulfilled the mitzvah, at least as we explained it a few moments ago, counting the days as well as the weeks. But Meimar used to count the days, but not the weeks, and his explanation was, Zecher lemikdashu. It is only a remembrance of the temple. Rashi, the famous commentator to the Talmud, explained, Meimar said that this counting is not an obligation since there is no omer. Rather, it is simply a remembrance of the temple. Therefore, counting only days suffice. So Meimar's explanation, explicated further by Rashi, is that we can't fulfill the mitzvah. Since the destruction of the temple in the year 70 of the Common Era, we haven't had a temple. We haven't had a functioning priesthood. There is no Kohen to bring the omer to. There is no temple to take the omer to. And so we're not really fulfilling the mitzvah, but nevertheless we fulfill part of the mitzvah as zecher lamikdash, as a remembrance of the mitzvah that we were able to perform when the temple still existed. Since the destruction of the temple over 1950 years ago, the bringing of the omer to the Kohen has not been performed. Abaye and Rav Ashi and Meimar, those Talmudic rabbis who spoke to us moments ago, lived centuries after the destruction of the temple. And since the destruction of the temple, many ancient rituals that were related to the sacrificial system and the priesthood and life in the Holy Land have been discontinued. Some of those rituals have been replaced by others. Some have been simply discontinued in the traditional hope that when the Messiah comes, perhaps those practices will be reinstituted. But despite the absence of the temple and the absence of the omer offering, we do continue to count the omer. The two halves of the mitzvah have been split, and we fulfill one of them, namely the counting. Or do we? What is the present status of the obligation? Some rabbinic scholars say that the two mitzvot were separate. In other words, even though we don't bring an omer anymore, the mitzvah of counting still stands. Thus, according to this opinion, our daily counting fulfills the biblical requirement stated in Leviticus 23:15. However, according to the majority of scholars, the counting described in the Bible was an intrinsic part of bringing the omer. Both halves comprised one mitzvah. Today's counting doesn't fulfill the mitzvah. It can't be fulfilled in a world without the temple. The present practice, according to most scholars, is simply zecher lemikdash, as the Talmudic passage described it, a remembrance of the temple ritual. It recalls the ancient bringing of the omer and evokes for many Jews the hope that in the Messianic period, this and other temple rituals will be performed once again. But despite this, the rabbis maintained the ritual of counting the omer as a full-blown ritual, bracha and all, which includes the phrase, Asher kiddishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al Sefirat Ha omer. You have sanctified us by your commandments, God, and you commanded us to count the omer. Even though the majority agreed that this modern ritual doesn't fulfill the biblical commandment. And even though the majority maintained that the practice was only rabbinic in authority, Jewish law still treated this particular mitzvah as seriously as those found right in the Torah. Why? Well, let's leave that question unanswered for a little while and turn to another wrinkle in the mystery of Sefirat Ha omer, namely the traditional prohibitions of the Sefirat Ha omer period. This period is traditionally observed as a time of semi-mourning. Here's the Talmudic explanation for this period of mourning. Amru 12,000 zugim talmidim hayu lo LaRabbi Akiva. It is said that Rabbi Akiva had 12,000 pairs of disciples, Gabat ad Antifras, from Gabat to Antipatris, v'chulan metu b'ferek echad, and all of them died at one time, shelo nahagu kavod zeh lazeh, because they didn't treat each other with respect. So according to this Talmudic passage and its various commentaries, a plague swept through the Jewish community, killing 12,000 pairs of Rabbi Akiva's students. And why did this plague kill all these people? Because they didn't treat each other with respect. The legend, and that's what this is, a midrash, a rabbinic legend, presents a brief morality play with an ethical lesson for us. This terrible tragedy, the death of 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva, occurred because they didn't treat each other with respect. That makes quite a statement about the ethical imperative of treating our fellow human beings respectfully. But the ethical implication of this legend notwithstanding, we have to ask ourselves, did this really take place? What does this brief midrash have to teach us? But now let's see how this legend is incorporated into Jewish law. And for that, we'll turn to the Shulchan Aruch, to the 16th century Code of Jewish Law, compiled by Rabbi Joseph Karo. Joseph Karo was a Sephardic rabbi, and so his perspective is that of the Sephardic community. The contemporary text of the Shulchan Aruch also includes glosses, comments by Rabbi Moses Isserles, an Ashkenazic authority, when that additional information is pertinent. And so we'll see, even in this brief passage from the Shulchan Aruch, both Rabbi Yosef Karo's words and Rabbi Moshe Isserles' words. We'll rush through this. Don't worry too much about the details, but let's see what this passage is trying to teach us. It is customary not to marry a woman between Pesach and Shavuot, that's this period that we call Sefirat Ha omer, until Lag BaOmer, until the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer, and we'll come back to that, because in that time, the students of Rabbi Akiva died. Now, the Talmudic passage simply told us about the tragedy that occurred. But here, centuries later, this code of Jewish law is telling us that we commemorate this tragedy by refraining from having weddings during this time. The passage in the Talmud simply told us about the tragedy. But here, centuries later, in this code of Jewish law, we learn that we commemorate this tragedy by refraining from scheduling weddings during this period. The Shulchan Aruch continues, however, to do Erusin and Kiddushin is fine. You know, there actually are two wedding ceremonies. There are two stages of getting married in Jewish law. And in ancient times, these two ceremonies were separated by weeks or months, or maybe even by a couple of years. Today, the two ceremonies are back to back, rather seamlessly joined, and so most people who attend Jewish weddings aren't really aware that they're seeing two ceremonies. But here, in the time of the Shulchan Aruch, the ceremonies still customarily were held separately. And so Yosef Karo tells us that to do Erusin and Kiddushin, to do the first ceremony, the preliminary marriage ceremony, that's fine. And even for Nisuin, the second ceremony, after which the couple begins to live together as husband and wife, even for Nisuin, if someone did so, we do not punish him. So the tradition is to refrain from scheduling weddings, but if you do the first preliminary wedding ceremony during this period, that's fine. But even if you do the second ceremony during the time of Sefirat Ha Omer, it may not be right, but the marriage is valid. No one gets punished for this violation of the law. And then Rabbi Isserles goes on and says, however, from Lag BaOmer onwards, all of this is permitted. So, at least according to Rabbi Isserles, it's okay to schedule weddings after Lag BaOmer. The first 33 days of the counting of the Omer, or maybe the first 32 days of the counting of the Omer, gets a little complicated here. During this first period, we don't schedule weddings. After Lag BaOmer, it's okay. Then the Shulchan Aruch goes on to describe one of the other trappings of mourning. In addition to not scheduling weddings, what else do we refrain from doing as a sign of our mourning during this period? Passage number 2. It is customary not to cut one's hair until Lag BaOmer, since it is said that that is when Rabbi Akiva's students stopped dying. Aha! According at least to some commentaries to the original Midrash, the plague raged for 49 days, but on the 33rd day, what we call Lag BaOmer, the plague lifted, and then tragically it resumed the following day. So 49 days of suffering, 49 days during which 12,000 pairs of Rabbi Akiva's students died, with the exception of the 33rd day, the plague lifted, and so the mourning restrictions are lifted on that day. So, Joseph Caro indicates that we refrain from getting haircuts during this time, at least until Lag BaOmer. On the other hand, someone who is performing a Brit Milah or having his son circumcised is allowed to cut his hair during Sfirah in honor of the circumcision. When you have a simcha like a bris, and those things are not planned too often in advance, a Jewish baby is born, and generally on the 8th day, he has his bris. So the mohel who is going to perform the bris and the father of the baby who is going to fulfill the mitzvah of having his son circumcised, they are allowed to get their hair cut in celebration of this happy occasion. Now it gets even more complicated. Some have the custom to cut their hair on Rosh Chodesh Iyar. Lag BaOmer occurs on the 18th day of Iyar, but on Rosh Chodesh, on the first day of the new month, and Rosh Chodesh is a minor holiday. It's minor, but it is a holiday, and so on Rosh Chodesh Iyar, some have the custom to cut their hair. But Caro says, that's a mistake. You shouldn't do that. But Rabbi Isserles reports, however, in many places, the custom is to cut their hair until Rosh Chodesh Iyar, and they do not cut their hair from Lag BaOmer forward, even though it is permitted to cut one's hair on Lag BaOmer itself. So Rabbi Isserles is telling us that there's a variety of practices. Some people refrain from haircuts throughout the period of Sefirat Ha Omer, with the exception of Lag BaOmer. Others do cut their hair until the month of Iyar begins, but then after that, they refrain from haircuts for the remainder of the period. And finally, but those places who have the custom to cut their hair from Lag BaOmer onwards do not cut at all after Pesach until Lag BaOmer. Well, if you find all of this confusing, you're in good company. I shared this with you not simply to confuse you, but to show that differences of observance are not a feature only of the modern Jewish world. Even in the 16th century, there were different approaches to the question of the prohibitions of the Sefirah period. Weddings were not performed during Sefirah, though sometimes they were. People didn't get their haircut during this period, though some people did. The minor holiday of Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer, was observed by some as a one-day suspension of these mourning practices, and observed by others as a complete ending of these mourning practices. And there was a confusing variety of practices regarding the schedule of those restrictions. For some, both before and after Lag BaOmer, for others, until Lag BaOmer, for still others, an entirely different schedule during these 49 days. So thus far, the Talmud tells us of a tragedy that's associated with the period of Sefirat Ha Omer, but doesn't mention anything about commemorating this tragedy with our own mourning practices. The Shulchan Aruch, centuries after the Talmud, deals with prohibitions of marriages and of cutting one's hair. More recently, and that is more recently than the 16th century, the customary prohibitions were broadened to include other celebrations and listening to instrumental music. Indeed, in contemporary times, many Jews continue to observe many of these restrictions, more commonly in the Orthodox world, but also among many observant non-Orthodox Jews, in terms of scheduling weddings, shaving and getting haircuts, and music and other entertainment. But the modern world has also seen new scholarship in the history of these practices, scholarship that might have implications in our own observances. I want to share with you some points included in two, what I consider, very important essays. One was written by the late Rabbi David Feldman, a noted conservative scholar of Jewish law, and he wrote this article in 1962. And after that, the points made in an article by Rabbi David Golinkin, which he wrote in 2007. First, Rabbi Feldman's article. He first mentions that the prohibitions, which again, we didn't see in that brief Talmudic passage, and Rabbi Feldman, who was a great Talmudic scholar, says with the credibility of a scholar, that the Talmud doesn't mention these mourning prohibitions. It's first mentioned in the Gaonic, in the post-Talmudic literature. And even when we turn to Moses Maimonides' 13th century Mishnah Torah, Maimonides' 13th century code of Jewish law, Rabbi Feldman tells us that Maimonides also doesn't mention mourning restrictions. Rabbi Feldman then tells us that these restrictions might actually be based on a Roman superstition against marriages in May, hence the so-called prohibition against weddings during this springtime period. Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the Omer, Rabbi Feldman tells us, is murky. And maybe it's not an anniversary of the one day during which the plague lifted. Another medieval scholar, whom Rabbi Feldman cites in his article, has an interesting explanation for the lifting of the restrictions on Lag BaOmer, and that explanation is that the students of Rabbi Akiva died only on days when Tachanun, the plaintive prayers during our weekday services, are recited. We don't say Tachanun on Shabbat, or major holidays, or minor holidays, or even in proximity to certain holidays. There are all sorts of days when we skip those plaintive Tachanun prayers. And so one medieval scholar suggests that if we take the 49 days of counting the Omer, and we subtract the 7 days of Pesach, that reduces 49 to 42, and we subtract 3 days of Rosh Chodesh, that minor holiday that commemorates the beginning of new months, and this period includes Rosh Chodesh Iyar, the beginning of the month of Iyar, and Rosh Chodesh Sivan, the beginning of the month of Sivan. So if you take 3 days away from the 42, that leaves 39. And if you subtract 7 Shabbatot, that 39 turns into 32. So 49 days of counting, less 16 days during which we don't say Tachanun, that's 32 days of mourning. And so on the 33rd day, the mourning restrictions are lifted. It's an interesting explanation, but it's a problematic explanation. As Rabbi Feldman indicates in his footnotes, there are different ways of calculating the days. The math becomes very, very muddled. And so the historical origin of Lag BaOmer, the 33rd day of the counting of the Omer, as a significant day is thrown into further doubt. The next point that Rabbi Feldman makes in his article is that haircutting and shaving were subsequently added to the prohibition on weddings. If we're not scheduling weddings because communally we're in a period of semi-mourning, then maybe we should do other things that mourners do, such as refraining from cutting our hair. And Rabbi Feldman tells us that the prohibition on listening to music was added even subsequent to that. So we begin with a tradition about not getting married during this period, and that gets extended to not cutting our hair, and that gets extended centuries later to not listening to music. And then Rabbi Feldman asks in his essay, all of this for Rabbi Akiva's students? Is that why we observe these traditions during most of this 49-day period? Because of an obscure story about Rabbi Akiva's students? Well, Rabbi Feldman tells us that perhaps this is a possible cryptic allusion to the deaths during the Bar Kokhba revolt. A few generations after the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem, the Jews tried to fight back. The Bar Kokhba revolt was militarily a failure. The Jews were not successful in defeating the powerful Roman Empire. The Bar Kokhba revolt was a period of tremendous Jewish suffering, and things got even worse for the Jews following that. And so Rabbi Feldman is suggesting that maybe our mourning practices during this period are not really about a plague that killed Rabbi Akiva's students, but rather the plague of war and oppression surrounding the Bar Kokhba revolt. And then Rabbi Feldman suggests that later tragedies in our history were added as well. The Crusades. The first crusade was at the end of the 11th century. And the Khmelnytsky massacres, a period of tremendous suffering for the Jews of Poland in the 17th century. And so maybe that period of suffering is appropriately commemorated by our mourning traditions during Sefirat Ha Omer. And so Rabbi Feldman suggests, for us, the relevance is commemorative mourning for numerous tragedies in our history. And so in the same essay in which he questions the historical veracity of the Rabbi Akiva's students' story, he also suggests other subsequent tragedies in our history that deserve commemoration and perhaps are appropriately commemorated by these mourning restrictions during the period of Sefirah. Rabbi Feldman argues that the whole point is to teach us lessons about mourning. What might have started out as a superstition-based observance has turned into commemorative mourning, and we should maintain them. And Rabbi Golinkin, in a sense, picks up where Rabbi Feldman had ended his explanation 40-something years earlier. He, too, asserts that the prohibitions of this period are not mentioned in the Talmud, are first mentioned in the Gaonic literature, in post-Talmudic literature. Rabbi Golinkin suggests to us that the Akiva theory itself is really very problematic. 12 and 12,000 are round numbers in rabbinic literature, sort of emblematic numbers, maybe numbers that really never were intended to be taken literally. In parallel passages, Rabbi Golinkin tells us, there are other round numbers. So the story of 12,000 pairs of Rabbi Akiva's students dying from this plague are in other versions of the story, other numbers. Most of the parallel passages do not mention when the tragedy occurred. And the tone of the Midrash is legendary because they did not treat each other with respect. That makes a nice little sermon, but it's not necessarily good history. And Rabbi Golinkin also points out that the Talmud itself says absolutely nothing about mourning customs to commemorate this tragedy. One contemporary scholar, says Rabbi Golinkin, says that the theory, the Rabbi Akiva theory, really has no historical basis at all. Rabbi Golinkin then presents what he calls the Lemuralia theory, an ancient Roman custom of not marrying during 31 days of May. There was an ancient Roman superstition that the dead roamed the earth in the springtime. That's not a good time for young women to get married. And so there was a Roman custom of not getting married during May, a custom that the Jewish community subsequently adopted. Rabbi Golinkin then presents what he calls the Gehinom theory. Gehinom, also known by its Yiddish pronunciation, Gehenna, is the Jewish term for hell. And so according to this theory, we mourn during this period for those of our departed loved ones who are suffering in Gehinom. Rabbi Golinkin also presents what he calls the agricultural anxiety theory. Maybe this semi-mourning is all about the anxiety of the spring harvest that might come in okay or that might not come in sufficiently. Rabbi Golinkin also cites the later attributions to the Crusades and the Khmelnytsky massacres, and he urges us to continue the process of reinterpreting these prohibitions. And so he mentions that springtime was the time of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Thus, the Sefirat restrictions for us might be a period of Holocaust commemoration. So in both of their essays, Rabbis Feldman and Golinkin reinterpret an ancient tradition whose origin is murky or irrelevant. We, of course, have been doing this for years, reinterpreting interpretations in view of new knowledge and new perspectives. So perhaps, therefore, as contemporary Jews, we should follow Rabbi Feldman's and Rabbi Golinkin's advice and maintain these restrictions. On the other hand, the mourning itself is of murky origin, most likely of Roman, that is, pagan origin, and I'm wondering how appropriate it is for us to maintain traditions now that we understand, perhaps more than our ancestors did, that so much of this tradition comes from Roman, that is, pagan origins. The original prohibition was on weddings. Haircutting was added later, instrumental music even later than that. So maybe it is appropriate for us to be liberal in our application of these mourning traditions. But note that both Rabbis Feldman and Golinkin, after casting much scholarly doubt on the historical basis of the mourning practices of Sefirat, nevertheless urge us to maintain these practices anyway by finding newer significance in these very old practices. On the other hand, 100 years ago, there lived a German Jewish philosopher named Franz Rosenzweig. One of the central themes of Rosenzweig's philosophy was the notion of the Jews as a meta-historical people, a people that lives beyond history. We don't simply live in the here and now, Rosenzweig taught. Rather, Jewish tradition, through our holidays, our prayers, and other practices, transports us to other times and places for us to vicariously re-experience important moments in our history. For example, on Pesach, we're with our ancestors in ancient Egypt, experiencing the horrors of enslavement and subsequently the triumph of liberation. On Hanukkah, we're with the Maccabees as they win their fight for Judaism. On Purim, we're in ancient Shushan, being saved from annihilation by Mordecai and Esther. And so when we consider the restrictions of the Sefirat period, perhaps this is our opportunity to travel back to those terrible times of the Bar Kokhba revolt, or the Crusades, or the Khmelnytsky massacres, or the Holocaust. We have many holidays to commemorate and celebrate our wonderful historic experiences. We also need to have mournful times to commemorate our terrible historic experiences. Let's return to that other question that we left unanswered. Why, if we can no longer fulfill the mitzvah of Sefirat Ha omer in a world without the temple, remember, we counted from the day we brought that sheaf of grain to the temple, why do we tenaciously hold on to this ancient ritual, pretending that we're fulfilling the mitzvah? Remember, long before the tragedies of medieval Jewish history, long before Rabbi Akiva, long before the Roman Empire, Sefirah was about that time between Pesach and Shavuot, the time after we left Egypt and before we received the commandments at Mount Sinai. What a difficult time that must have been. We were no longer slaves to Pharaoh, but we hadn't yet become servants of God. Without Torah, our lives had no meaning. And maybe that's another reason for the mourning practices of this period, to commemorate this empty time in our history, to force us to contemplate the spiritual emptiness of a life without Torah. But when we stood at Mount Sinai, when we met God at that holy mountain, our freedom became complete. Or to put it another way, by counting the days between the two holidays, by bridging these two holidays and the events they commemorate, we learn a simple and profound lesson. What began on Pesach became complete on Shavuot. And so by counting the days between Pesach and Shavuot, just like a child who counts the days until this or that holiday or birthday, we excitedly prepare for our own journey to Mount Sinai, for our own meeting with God.